WCY TV Productions, where our motto is dig deeper than the corporate media. Tonight, we have a very special guest. His name is Neil Sanders. Neil is considered an expert on the subject of mind control and has been studying the history of this dark art and its application by military, government intelligence agencies across the globe for many years. Neil has appeared on numerous television shows and made radio appearances in Europe and the USA. Neil, hello.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. Hey, just opening it up, what got you interested in mind control?
Oh, right. Well, I mean, it was all a bit sort of serendipitous, really. I did psychology and construction of media, or media production, when I was at university, and all the techniques that I've learned were all analog, so they're completely obsolete now, and were about 10 minutes after I finished them, basically. But the psychological aspect of it always interested me, as you probably know. There tends to be a bit of a bleed through in these two sort of subjects, like things like positioning of a person, drawing on archetypes for expressing a character in a very short space of time, the way that fonts or the way that colours, or just like the presentation of a mise-en-scene can actually sort of can affect you, can give you either sort of instinctive psychological messages or learnt cultural cues that can be sort of exploited and can tell a long story in basically one picture, essentially. And then from the back of that, I was also doing psychology, and so I was learning about things like the subconscious mind and how that can be influenced and various other aspects of it, like repressed memories and that type of thing. And a friend of mine basically forced me to watch the film The Manchurian Candidate, and I didn't really want to because, you know, it was black and white and it had Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury, and I don't care about those people. But I was about 15 at the time. And it turned out it was fantastic, and I really, really thoroughly enjoyed it, and it opened up my mind to the possibility of, you know, double agents and, say, false flag type operations and mind control via hypnosis in this case. And what piqued my interest was the fact that basically it seemed plausible. You know, it wasn't doable just by telling somebody, but the mechanism was there whereby actually this is conceivable. I could see why they would be trying this sort of thing. You could see how you could influence a person like this. So I started to look at the available data, and actually there's quite a lot of declassified documents, particularly pertaining to the American mind control program, which was called MKUltra. And it transpires that far from being science fiction, this was actually something that both, well, certainly the US, the UK, Russia to an extent, and many other nations were actually very, very interested in the concept of mind control. And it basically boiled down to four broad topics. One would be the search for a truth serum. This is obviously very, very useful in some sort of interrogation scenario, or with a captured spy or a captured enemy agent or something like that. And then the flip side of that is some sort of drug or some sort of mechanism whereby your own agent could resist interrogation. So like an anti-truth serum or something that would make you impervious to this types of methods. The third, which sounds very, very strange, is essentially what could be termed Manchurian candidates. It's the control of somebody's actions, the control of somebody's thoughts, putting voices into people's heads, roboticizing people, making people act in a way that is contrary to their own particular beliefs, even their own self-preservation. Turning somebody into a spy or an assassin, essentially making somebody malleable so that you have total control of their thoughts or actions. And this sounds very much like science fiction, but it actually, if you look at the declassified documents, it was certainly they were very successful in a lot of their experimentation. And then the fourth area, which is sort of broader, really is to do with public relations or propaganda. And they're actually the same thing as people may or may not realise. After the Second World War, or after the First World War, I think actually, Edward Bernays was getting into the concept of public relations. People like Ivy Lee were making the perceptions of companies favourable so that people would buy things for pleasure rather than necessity. And one of the main aspects of this is, and still is today, is advertising and public relations. Now, public relations was initially called what it is, which is peacetime domestic propaganda, because that's really what it is. It's trying to change the way that you think about a product, or change your perception, or make you believe something that you hadn't necessarily believed before. Now, the problem was that propaganda has got the phrase propaganda has got a bad rap, thank you very much, Nazis and communists, because they'd just spent the last however many years explaining to the civilian population of the UK and the US that basically this is what is called propaganda. Propaganda is bad. So the irony is that public relations is actually the marketed phrase for propaganda, because they felt that they needed to propagandize the concept of propaganda and therefore call it public relations.
Yeah, that sounds much. Public relations makes it just sound like it's a cooperation between the people that have power and the people that are maybe the voters.
Well, I mean, the power of words is incredibly powerful. I mean, collateral damage. Collateral damage doesn't sound like anything we should really be bothered about, does it, to be quite honest? But what collateral damage is dead women and children. But it's a way of softening off the brutality of war, the brutality of an invasive force in a foreign land, and sanitizing that for the population back home. And this is done, in numerous ways. It can be done on the flip side as well. During before the Second World War, the phrase isolationist was being put around in America, and like anybody essentially that didn't want to go to war or felt that America should be part of the war was called an isolationist, and this was deemed as a negative term, and something that would basically shame people into silence or to changing their opinion. Like, interestingly, the concept of the negative connotations of the phrase conspiracy theorist are a direct response to the Warren Report, which was obviously the investigation into the John F. Kennedy assassination. And basically because when the Warren Report came out, a lot of people were quite cynical of its findings and felt that it perhaps had not uncovered the absolute truth about the incident. There was a lot of discourse, dissent, and a lot of people talking about it and making sort of, questioning things, making anti-government sentiments and such like that. And so the CIA actually popularized the phrase conspiracy theorist to be used as a negative with a negative connotation, to be somebody that's not doing an investigation, that's somebody that's being very silly and stretching the truth and basically looking for things that aren't there really. And so, this is how language is used. It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I mean, if you just use the word, I usually throw this out at students, and I say that I'll say, look up the definition of leadership and the definition of manipulator. Mm. And when they do, they're like, "Hey, wait a minute. In reality, there is not much of a difference. But if I say you're showing leadership ability, that's a positive thing. But if I say you're a very manipulative person, that's negative. Even though the definitions are pretty similar."
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is the point. It can be flipped. Terrorist or freedom fighter is the other one, and that's what's clever about those is the construction of those phrases is they're incredibly emotive. Terrorist, we know what that is. We have an idea of that. Freedom fighter, we have a completely different thing. And it comes down to two things, really. I mean, how this can be best utilized in either something as simple as advertising or, excuse me, as nefarious as invading another country under a false premise in order to steal their natural resources. And that's the construction of imagery. Now, Walter Lippmann, who I'm sure your listeners are probably familiar with, in his book, I can't remember what it's called now. I've gone totally simple. But essentially, he said that the way to control... He was one of these people that felt that The general population, anybody that's below a certain sort of class strata and a certain wealth level, is not a responsible person, and they shouldn't be given any responsibility in life. They're essentially a braying herd, a huge sort of mass of people that don't really know what they're doing and respond mostly to sort of base instinctive drives and need to be controlled by the wealthy for their own good.
So essentially, the leaders of the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States.
That's them. That's the ones. Yeah. It's curious how that's worked out, isn't it? But basically, he said that the best way to do this is is essentially to sort of hack the way that people decode the world. And it's just the majority of people decode the world through sort of what would be called they've learned it from other places, and they have pictures in their heads. Most people have not actually seen something like a polar bear in real life or a panda or whatever, but you've been informed about them. You've perhaps seen one on the television or something like that. So you've got a picture inside your head. Most people have never seen or come across a terrorist. But if I say terrorist, most people have got now an image in their head. Where did that image come from? Because I'll guarantee that through no fault of your own, a lot of you are thinking of a guy with a turban and a beard. Now, is that necessarily the case? In some cases, yeah. But that's not the definition of terrorist. So how does that imagery get put into people's heads? And it's quite curious how essentially, he was saying that if people find a lump of gold that is, also a lump of metal that's coloured yellow, they will act as if they've discovered gold until they find out that it's fool's gold. If you put on every single map that the edge of the world you'll fall off, no one will go there because basically they'll believe the maps. And so if you can inform these pictures, or if you can basically paint them first, you've got a far better chance of, controlling large swathes of the population with the sort of stimuli response thing, essentially. And it's curious that again, this sort of ties in with the coercive nature of the sort of more personal types of mind control. Essentially isolation, social isolation, and depression is one of the easiest ways of making people malleable. And this is the point. It was there is a distinct psychological nuance to the an overarching cycle. Basically, the majority of people that were involved in mind control were the very cream of the psychological elite at the time. There were people like hypnotist George Estabrooks and J.G. Watkins and Morse Allen and Martin Orne, who were all sort of leaders in their field. And then William Sargent and Ewan Cameron. Ewan Cameron was the head of the Psychiatric Institute of America and Canada, and also was one of the advisors on the board of the Nuremberg trials. So these are incredibly sort of well thought of people. William Sargent basically headed up an entire department at St Thomas's Hospital in London. So this is what's very, very strange about these mind control programs, or these instances of mind control, is that the real top people are involved in this, and it is questionable sometimes what they knew and how sort of nefarious they were being.
Well, the thing that I think listeners, if there's someone that's kind of a novice and is thinking, "What's all this stuff I'm hearing here? This sounds really bizarre." The thing is that, correct me if I'm wrong, after World War I, that's when most of this stuff was focused on marketing and what we actually do consider public relations.
Yeah, from about 1921, basically.
Yeah, but after the war, there was this really strong desire to control populations so you didn't wind up with Soviet or Nazi revolutions in the future. And so,
yes. And the sort of the trend was towards consumption, conspicuous consumption, and again, people like Lippmann and Bernays and Ivy Lee sort of introduced the concept of better homes, keeping up with the Joneses, essentially buying for pleasure, not for necessity. which is essentially capitalism. So you're quite right in the sense that I suppose it was deemed as the antithesis of communism.
Yeah, but Bernays, he felt that the way to preserve capitalism, or democracy, I should say, the way to preserve democracy was to distract people through a consumption-based society. Therefore, they're too busy trying to find the trendy clothes, shoes, cars, and so forth, and they're not so concerned with what's going on at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. It's aspiration. Aspiration is a distraction. Yeah, completely. I mean, to be fair, that's nicer than the Tavistock Institute's method. The Tavistock Institute is the psychological operations connected to the British government. It's like one of the leading psychological think tanks, and it's also connected in various aspects to the military. It started off in the 1920s as basically helping soldiers with shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, as we would call it now. And it was by a chap called Hugh Crichton Miller actually started it. But very soon it became apparent that actually, if you look at their sort of documentation and stuff, that they're actually looking at the breaking point of man. What happens if you push a person's psyche to such a degree is they essentially break. And they discovered that what happens is people revert to like a blank slate, and they look to authority figures for an immediate answer and for guidance through life, basically. This is a technique called future shock to induce what's called fluidity, and this was the idea of a chap called Kurt Lewin, who came from the Frankfurt School, but became the head of the Tavistock Institute in 1932. He also went on to help found MIT, Stanford Research Institute, the RAND organization, the National Institute of Mental Health in America, and Esalen. And they also basically advise on the board of people like BP, Unilever, the US military, the British Parliament, and stuff like that, with what's called authority aimed training, which is basically teaching people to be better politicians or leaders of industry. Now, their idea was the flip side of this sort of buying for pleasure. Their idea was essentially to induce trauma onto people, onto civilians, or traumatic situations that make people frightened. And again, they say that what this does is it reduces people to a fight or flight state, where essentially, again, they look to authority for comfort. Now, that could be authority in the guise of the police or the government or whatever. Please help us from this terrible tragedy that's happened. And then you're perhaps more likely to not question their response. But that can also be applied, most people's authority figures, or most people, certainly most young people's authority figures, they're not politicians, they're celebrities. And so this thing, this concept of retail therapy, is a real thing, really. People essentially, you could argue that people buy stuff to plug a gap in the psyche, or alternatively to let people know and to let yourself know how well you're doing in life. Because if you've got all these nice things, if you're wearing Caesar's clothes, you're probably Caesar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard that they did a study in, I think it was the 1950s, that found that if you go into a nice neighborhood, you would look at the cars, and most people park their cars inside the garage. But then if you looked at homes that still had garages, but there was in the poor area, they parked their cars out because they might not be able to afford a nice house, but they put a lot of money into a car that looked like they were actually more successful than they were. And I've heard that's used like on the music videos. You might make rap videos that the guy's got all these, adoring strippers or whatever sitting on a car. Yeah.
If you want to be successful, you promote an image of success. Like it's an old marketing trick, basically. It's called positive association. That's why that's why you drape a lady over a sports car. What's that actually got to do with it? Nothing. You could make the connection, I suppose, that if I buy the car, ladies like that might want to lie on the top of my car, and therefore they might want to go to bed with me, which is true to an extent. But it's more just the concept of positive association, which is why just do it. What does that actually mean? Doesn't mean anything really, but there are a billion associations. I bet loads of people are sat there now going, it means this, it means this, it means this. It does if it means it to you, but that's what's genius about these phrases. The best a man could get, the drive of your life. They don't really mean anything. They just give a vague, positive image around the product.
Oh yeah, like change you can believe in.
Oh, that's the best one, absolutely. You know, keep it vague. And allow people to put their own meaning on it. Make America great again. Mm-hmm. It's essentially what's called a weasel word. I mean, again, it's used very heavily in advertising. The most famous one is, with repeated use, this product will remove the visible signs of dandruff flakes. Now, what does that sentence actually mean? It doesn't mean anything, because every single word qualifies the other word, and every single word can have numerous meanings. Like, essentially, the concept of a weasel word is that it looks like it's sound, but actually, if you pick away at it, it's hollow. There's no innards to this word. So basically, let's have a look at that phrase again. So, with repeated use, what does that mean? Is that 1 billion times a day? How much should you use? Like, it never explains. What do they mean by reduce the visible signs of dandruff flakes? I know what you think it means. It means it's going to get rid of your dandruff. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Reduce, not get rid of. To what degree? What is the visual signs of dandruff flakes? What even qualifies as a dandruff flake?
Yeah, it's like some candy in America. I think they have these like labels saying 0 saturated fat.
Right, good.
It doesn't, explain that if sugar, it's going to turn into fat.
Yeah. Well, exactly. But again, it's just a positive association. You get that with loads of low fat. If you actually look at lots of low fat products, they're very, very high in sugar and therefore quite calorific sometimes. So they're not actually going to help you diet in any way, or even if they do, they're going to have other negative effects. You can do stuff like spurious rigor, which is basically this will reduce the signs of aging by 87.6%, and which makes you go, oh wow, if they've got that down to such a precise level of 87.6%, well, that means that they must have been incredibly thorough in their testing. It must have been scientific above all. Like, or, there's the unfinished claims as well, and this is essentially stuff like change you can believe in and stuff like that. But the most famous one is, excuse me, 4 out of 5 dentists who chew gum recommend Trident sugarless. And, basically you go, oh, wow. And then, again, that's a Bayesian thing. That's an appeal to authority, essentially. It's a third-party advocacy, which is essentially an expert. We're hardwired to think that experts know what they're doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be experts. And we're also hardwired to, most of the time, believe people in positions of authority. Because why would they lie? But basically, so what that's saying is 4 out of 5. So that's the majority. Brilliant. That's the best product in the world. Who are these dentists? Why do they recommend it? In what circumstances do they recommend it? And the most important question of all, which is never ever going to get asked, what in God's name is so wrong with this product that one of those dentists wants nothing to do with it whatsoever?
Good point. I never thought about that one.
This is the point. If you ask the questions like, or closely examine any of these techniques, they fall apart because they're like a magic trick, essentially. It's a distraction. And the whole point is to try and convince you to buy something. I mean, Claude Terrapay, who's an incredible marketing genius, not sure if he's an evil genius, he may be, but he said that basically the best marketing strategy in the world is where people go, I want that, and you ask them why, and they go, I'm not really sure, I just want it. Then you can pat yourself on the back. You've done a successful marketing trick there. The best way, and again, this is Claude Terrapay. He basically he says the reptilian brain or the instinctive id will always win because, you know, fundamentally you like pleasure. You want to go with your sort of baser instincts, and it'll particularly always win if you give it an intellectual get out clause. And the most famous example of this is the sale of the Hummer in America. Like, the Hummer is a terrible, terrible car, but it sold incredibly well. The same with that Ford pickup truck, actually. That's one of the most, well-sold vehicles in the world. And it's awful. It's a terrible, terrible car. Both of them are. So why do they sell so well? Well, because they were marketed as weapons. I mean, in the case of the Hummer, they literally are a weapon. They're a military vehicle or an ex-military vehicle. Like, it's not quite the same, but that's the point. You're high up on the road. You've got like 20 feet of car each way. Nobody's gonna do you any damage in that. You're in a weapon. You're powerful. You're looking down on people. You are physically looking down on other road users. Okay? How do you justify that? Well, I'm protecting my wife and children. I'm not doing it to show off and to show other people, yeah, look at me, I'm the big man. No. I'm doing it in a far more sensitive way, protecting my family, which is the justification. So, you know, that's how marketing works, essentially.
Yeah, I want to get back to marketing, but I just want to wrap up a couple other areas. You mentioned the thing about the psychology where if you make people fearful, they become more malleable to authority or something to solve the anxiety caused by the fear. Is this why in the Western world, all of the news programs start out with that, like, you see the carnage somewhere? I mean, people don't even know where these countries are most of the time, especially in America. If they say, well, there was this big flood in Bangladesh, and they're like, Bangladesh, I mean, that's awful. And you're like, well, where's Bangladesh? And like, I don't know, somewhere near Canada maybe. But the thing is that you get these, even local news. Oh, look, here was a car accident. You know, a kid died, and look, here's a picture. We're blurring the face out. You know, those kinds of things. If it
bleeds, it leads.
Yeah. And the thing is that you wonder. Is there like, did someone somewhere figure out this is what gets people to watch the news? Or was it something that was developed as a marketing strategy originally and then put into practice?
Well, I mean, it certainly can be put into practice because we take away the sort of, the negative, mostly. I mean, there is a concept called mean world syndrome, which basically, you know, the more likely you are to watch the world, essentially, it's the more likely you are to believe the way that the world is presented. And you know, as we've just discussed, basically, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. It's it's part of what's called cultivation theory, which is basically, again, the concept that you start to believe that the world as presented is far more violent, essentially, than it really is, because that's constantly what you're seeing on the news, and you start to take that for an accurate representation of life, and then basically people get afraid of the real world. The other way that works is that basically, for some strange reason, people always hang on to the negative words in headlines. So if you want to slander somebody, you ask a question like, I don't know, something that would be, is Hillary a racist? Now, what your brain will do is take away Hillary racist, or is Trump a racist, or whatever. Like, I'll be equal there. So you can slander people by simply asking a question over and over again. But, you know, it's very, very, very strange that yes, you know, we do get this sensational news. We do get these politicians that play on people's fears. And these are well-known techniques for controlling populations, basically, for influencing behavior, and for getting your own way, essentially. It is a very basic propaganda technique, really. I mean, if people, as we've already said, like, people go into a fight or flight mechanism, And then what you do is you give them black and white options. Are you with us? Or are you with the terrorists? Well, I'm with you, for God's sake. Of course I am. Like, oh, right, good. Well, then you won't be, you'll be quite happy to go along with this. And yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, no one's ever come out and said, yeah, this is why we do the news. This is why we do it like this, because it's basically a way of browbeating populations. But, you know, it works. Even if it's by accident.
Yeah, I mean, it's a template that just seems to be everywhere, and no one seems to have tried something different. And the commercials, at least in the United States, you have horrible news, like for 10 minutes. Oh, these people blew up. These people crashed. These people got this weird illness, you know, and this kind of stuff. And then you have these commercials with happy people buying stuff for like 5 minutes. You know, it's joyful. Everything's wonderful. In fact, in America, you can advertise drugs in the same way. Oh, ask your doctor. Side effects may include death. But, you know, it's thrown out there. And it seems to me that it's like, oh, now you got these people, their adrenaline's pumping, and then all of a sudden you're saying, oh, but look, here's happiness, buy this.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And of course, you know, advertisers will be aware of that, and I imagine that the slots directly after sort of like, you know, top of the hour news or whatever are incredibly expensive because of that very thing. And you can do two things. You can either offer a comfort, or you can grab that fear and you can ratchet it right up. And that's usually done by very, very sort of innocuous type products like personal hygiene products. Because they'll always insinuate that basically you get the girl. Okay? Well, what's that actually saying? It's saying that you won't get the girl if you don't use this product. So again, it's playing on that fear. It's subtly playing on that fear. So you're absolutely right, yeah. They appreciate you're in this malleable state. And, I mean, you could even go so far as to say basically the concept of, just the act of watching a television, relaxing, doing something you've done a million times before, fixating with your eyes, in the right circumstances, it can drop you into what would be considered a post-hypnotic state, essentially, because your brainwaves slow down. Some people think that waves come out of the television. That's not right. I'm a professional hypnotherapist. Essentially, all you need to do to put somebody into hypnosis is to get them to fixate on something with their eyes and talk to them to the point where they relax and are distracted. And then you relax them and keep deepening it and deepening it and deepening it. And what that does is, if you hook them up to machinery, it shows that their brainwave activity actually slows. This effect also happens when people watch television. This is why a lot of people find that they fall asleep in front of the television, because they simply relax to the point where, it's nod off. But what does that mean? That means essentially a lot of the time adverts and television in general is having a conversation with your subconscious, particularly if it's just on in the background. And your subconscious has got literally no critical analysis. It just takes things literally and just runs with them, essentially. And so this is why all these techniques work, the positive association, the spurious rigor, the use of certain language, because you don't decode it, you just take the positive elements of it and go, brilliant. I don't know why, but I'm buying Trident gum tomorrow. And, it's a tried and tested method.
Yeah, and this also explains why the politicians would then spend so much money on posters that are just slogans or like these cute. I mean, face it. I mean, you could take any villain of history, any villain, Countess Bathory, whatever, and you could, with the right advertising, you could make them look like the most wonderful person that ever lived.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's all about, again, painting pictures in people's heads. The control of information, the manufacture of consent, what is justifiable, what's not justifiable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
now going back to Tavistock though, because is it true? And I've heard this. I'm not sure if it's correct, but I've heard some of the studies, some of the research that they do is just like so. It costs so much money. You could. The only people that would have access to this would be think tanks, corporations, and so forth. It's not just something you're going to go on the line and read their research.
Oh, Yeah, I mean, they offer, they do authoritarian training to world business leaders, blue chip companies and stuff like that. They have clients that are blue chip companies, and they tell them what to do. They're advisors on management structure and such. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, it's such it grew from one tiny clinic essentially into such a vast undertaking. It basically touches every aspect of psychological life, child psychology, the looking at the way that we school people, looking at work conditions, just absolutely every facet of psychology is examined under this broad umbrella in some manner or whatever. They were even involved in the propaganda of places like Crewe House and Wellington House, which were the propaganda houses that Bernays and Walter Lippmann were actually connected to, vaguely, helped with some of it. And bizarrely, these also involved people like Lord Northcliffe, and these are basically media magnates of the time, people who owned some of the more popular newspapers and the like in the UK and also in America as well. So you see this cross contamination of different disciplines for what they believe to be a good cause, essentially. And that's not to excuse them, just to sort of explain how they would justify it, essentially. How this
Well, yeah, I mean, just like something like if you believe there's overpopulation.
Yeah.
I've read articles in mainstream press where they've actually said that such things as soap operas in Latin America, which are very popular, you do such things as present the young woman skipping marriage when she's first offered when she's like 17 and getting a college degree and then becoming happily married when she's 28. Or you show the guy that, wants his wife to have 7 kids and he's the bad guy, but you can
these
kinds of things have actually reduced fertility in strongly Catholic countries down to about 2 children per family. Now, some people would say, well, that's wonderful. You don't want to bring more people into maybe an impoverished area. But at the same time, that shows just how powerful the media can be in giving you an image in your mind of what is proper and what is not proper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that sounds quite similar to nudge theory, essentially, which is, a series of psychological nudges or prods that sort of slowly lead you in a particular way. And, the present Conservative government in England hire these sorts of people, to try and promote policy and such like that. But I mean, this is the thing. But it's always framed as a reasonable response. I mean, if we just, I know we sort of drifted off the subject, but mind control being truth serums, torturing people, Manchurian candidates, the use of children as sex slaves, LSD experiments on the mentally ill and members of the public. All of this was justified, and all of this is absolutely 100% documented. All of this was justified because it was apparently a response to Korean and other Russian mind control, Russian and communist mind control programs that were apparently going on, making American GIs denounce their citizenship and join the communist order. And it transpired that this was all nonsense, that they were told to do this. There was no real sort of sophisticated mind control program in China or Korea. They just used isolation and forced indoctrination through beatings, essentially. But the point was that basically all the American programs, things like Chatter, which started in 1947, Bluebird started in April 1951, and then turned to MK Ultra. Basically, when it was discovered that these programs existed, they said, "Yeah, sorry, we didn't tell you about that. We basically did that as a response to the Korean War. Now, the problem with that is that at least 2 of those programs predate the Korean War by several years. So, it transpires that that was a mind control program in itself, just trying to convince the population that we weren't the West weren't leaders in the field of research into mind control.
Well, that sounds a little bit similar to when all these emails got hacked, showing that essentially it just seemed like the primaries for that Bernie Sanders was kind of, he had the election stolen from him.
Yeah, pretty much. They decided that they didn't want him to represent them.
Right, but at the same time, then it seems the media in America has made it sound like it's not really paying attention to that. It's like, oh, the Russians may have done it. Oh my gosh, the Russians. And then you change the focus people have.
Absolutely, yeah. Totally.
There's no proof the Russians had anything to do with it. It's still like, oh my gosh, the Russians, yeah. It's like a little kid. He gets caught with his hand in the candy jar, and he suddenly looks out the window and goes, hey, look what the neighbor's doing.
Yeah. Well, that's nonsense, isn't it? Like, it's been very, well, the American media is, all media is very strange, to be quite honest. But again, there's been numerous accounts of propaganda operations. One of the most famous ones was during the Yugoslavia conflict, or former Yugoslavia conflict. Basically, it transpired that the CIA had installed at least 1,500 CIA agents who'd basically taken jobs as journalists in CNN, and their job was to what was the phrase that they used? Lead the direction of the news, which some could take as being, propaganda. Basically reporting only the things that they wanted to be reported. And one person basically, when he was questioned on this, said, essentially, it was discovered by a Dutch newspaper called Trouw, and one of their journalists asked one of the guys, come on, you are you influencing the news? Are you actually, propagandizing the American public? He says, well, I can't really answer that. It's above my pay grade. I don't know, but I would assume that's what we're doing because that's my job. Mm-hmm. So, some took that to be an admission. but yeah, there's been numerous occasions. People like George Tenet of the CIA said, we don't need to own individual journalists because, we own people on the board level of magazines like Time and such like that.
Well,
so...
Yeah, and the weird thing is that I just remember, growing up as a kid when, the government was sort of the enemy, of the journalists. They were out there, catch Richard Nixon doing whatever, Watergate. They had the Watergate hearings. I remember this because all my favorite shows were canceled, when I was a kid, like Dark Shadows and, Star Trek or whatever. But they were canceled because they had these hearings on all the networks so people could see this. But it's totally changed now. You got this. It's like the government. I don't care if it's Bush or Obama, as if there's any difference. They come out and say, here's the news, and hand it to the journalist, and it's in a nice prepackaged folder.
Well,
and they all go out there and report it as if they've investigated it.
Well, that's very true, but I'll just raise 2 points. Bob Woodward was a CIA agent that was there to get Carl Bernstein away from the real story. That's been admitted. Furthermore, when Nixon actually had that interview with Frost, Sir David Frost as he is now, in which he came out with it's not illegal if the president does it, and all this, which was seen as a tacit admissal of wrongdoing, or a complete admissal of wrongdoing. That was scripted by the White House. It was a publicity drive that was that basically served to weaken the president's public persona and therefore allow him to get away with it. So it's always been shifty.
Yeah, I do a series of fictional books, but it's, I do social commentary within, and in the upcoming one, the main heroine, gets elected to Congress and is surprised when she makes friends with these really influential people, goes in for a network interview and gets the questions prior to the interview.
Ah.
and it's just like, well, what is this? Now that actually really does take place, doesn't it?
I'm sure, absolutely. I'm convinced it does. Like, and just to sort of wind it down, because I appreciate that. I'm not sure what your audience usually is used to, and I appreciate that this is getting into a bit of tinfoil hat sort of area. But basically, just give you two sort of ideas of how sort of media and other interests intertwine. Well, first off, at a board level, you'll get people like Time Warner, for example, are also in a conglomerate sort of relationship with people like Lockheed Martin and other British Aerospace and other weapons manufacturers. So there have been numerous cases whereby they have ignored or bumped certain stories that might be seen as detrimental to other interests on a board level. Because, well, for two reasons. A, because it's bad business, and B, because you could make the argument that if you're doing something that is detrimental to your shareholders, you are breaking the law. So there's all these sort of very, very strange things. It even bleeds into things like music. Tupac Shakur had his second album held back for quite a long time because of the same thing. Essentially, the parent company of his record company was Time Warner. And he'd made some statements that were he essentially said, we've got money for war but can't feed the poor. This was seen as incredibly detrimental against what could be deemed the military-industrial complex and certainly was harmful to shareholders. And so the record company held back a potential hit record for about a year, I believe. I may be wrong about that. Completely stupid from the perspective of the record company, but very sound from the perspective of their shareholders.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I've read that we're going to talk about entertainment here for the remaining few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it was in the British press. I don't remember which newspaper, but they reported that the Pentagon has a huge influence on movies that are made in Hollywood. And they can use that leverage that when you see the aliens come down, there's all these really cool jet fighters flying, and you're wondering, well, who is filming the jet fighters? Is this computer? Well, they have that leverage that, hey, you play by our rules, you get this and this and this.
Yeah.
How strong is that connection?
Oh, completely. I mean, there's a liaison department in Hollywood that was set up via the CIA and the Department of Defense. Originally by George Tenet, who was the ex-head of the CIA. I'm not entirely sure who's involved now. There's a chap called Tom Secker, who is incredibly knowledgeable about this sort of stuff, and he does podcasts and stuff, and he's very, very good on this. But yeah, you can have anything you like, pretty much, from the American military. You can have aircraft carriers, you can have planes, you can have troops, you can have whatever you want. Same exists to a lesser degree with the FBI. Like, for example, Silence of the Lambs was given access to Quantico and the training facilities to be allowed to film. Why, you may ask? Well, because Clarice Starling, or the character of Clarice Starling, really, really boosted female applicants to the FBI and to all types of law enforcement. It was a recruiting tool. And this is the same thing with other films. You can use whatever you want, but the bottom line is the Department of Defense gets final rewrite of the script. And so there's been numerous occasions. There was I forget which, it was a relatively recent Bond film. And by relatively recent, I mean about 10 years ago. But basically, in it, something got stolen. Someone made a mess up, and originally it was supposed to be an American admiral or something like that. And it says, you're not doing that. You're not making us look stupid. Change it to France. But basically, they had to borrow something or they had to do some filming in France as well. So the French government said, no, you're not doing that. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, you're not making us look stupid. And so in the end, I think they made it Canadian. I may be wrong about that. But I may be wrong about the details. But the point is that there's been dozens and dozens. There's a book called Operation Hollywood that basically lists all the occasions whereby Hollywood has actually made these changes. And then there's other occasions, like at the height of his career, Kevin Costner, when he was really doing good business, like before he fouled everything up. When he was like a major sort of box office draw, he directed and starred in a film called 13 Hours, which was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And basically, he refused to make changes to the script, and so he was denied any help to the from the Department of Defense. So it cost him a huge amount. Bizarrely, also that film wasn't really very heavily pushed by the parent company. So were hidden hands moving. But lots and lots of films that you wouldn't really realise are financed by the military, like Transformers and X-Men and the Avengers. Because essentially they make explosions and guns and planes look cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they make the movie, but they have something to do with it.
They get final rewrite of the script. It's as simple as that. Anything they don't like goes out. Anything they want to add, you have to do it if you want to use their stuff. It's really as simple as that. Mm-hmm. And they do it with television programs as well. JAG was sponsored by the Department of Defense. And occasionally they do sort of clever double bluffs where basically, like the Green Berets was the first to do this. That was obviously a recruitment tool for the Green Berets by John Wayne, and he did it as a favour to the military because he wanted to make the Green Berets look cool. But they purposely left that off the end. They didn't say thanks to the Green Berets, thanks to whatever, because they felt that would be too obvious. Just to give you an idea, the day after Top Gun came out, 1 million people signed up to the Air Force and the Navy.
Wow. Yeah, I've noticed something too, and I don't know if it's just just coincidence, but for about the last 15, or a little bit longer, maybe 20 years, science fiction movies especially, I love sci-fi,
Yeah.
The thing is that they have more and more shown that, I don't know, when the aliens attack or when the troops go out to another planet, there's always totally 100% integrated male-female forces.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if that is not something that has been more promoted as a means by which, with volunteer armies, you boost females joining the military when there's all these role model Marine girls killing the nasty aliens.
It normalizes it to an extent, doesn't it? Like, absolutely. I could see that it could be used as a recruitment tool. Sorry, there was two other films I wanted to talk about, which both they officially got no help from the Department of Defense, but I just don't believe that for a second, because the director, Catherine Bigelow, was privy to classified CIA documents that even members of Congress were not allowed to see, like top secret Magic Eyes or whatever it is called, like really, really top secret documents when she was filming both The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30. And what's strange about both of those films is that they justify, the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. They paint a very negative picture of the civilian population as basically terrorists and murderers. And also they justify torture. And also, and sell the idea of being a sexy gung-ho Marine. War's like a drug, man. Like, it's nonsense. It's a recruitment tool. It's so blatantly a recruitment tool. Actually, what was strange was certain people who actually do that job, that's portrayed in The Hurt Locker, came out publicly and said that this was a massively, massively irresponsible film. And it was only after that the Department of Defense came out and publicly said, well, we had nothing to do with it. It's like, well, yes, you did. Yes, you did. You get to have your cake and eat it too there. You get to justify, like, torture in a really over-the-top way and say, whoa, that's nothing to do with us. It was just despicable, really, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and the reach of Hollywood. I mean, I've been in Tibet before, and you go into a restaurant and they're playing American shows.
Oh, I'll tell you.
It just reaches everywhere.
I'll tell you how influential Hollywood is. How do you make a sword?
The sword.
Yeah, how do you make a sword? You've seen how you make a sword in films. You heat up metal, you hammer it with a thing,
Oh,
and
okay.
then what's the final thing you do with the sword to make sure that it's really strong? You plunge it into freezing cold water, don't you?
Well, I think they did that on Conan the Barbarian. If I remember
Well, they do
right.
it on every film. They do it on Braveheart. They do it on. It's the standard thing. You know why? Because it looks really cool. You know, if you did that, you'd destroy your sword. Also, there's loads of Hollywoodisms that are basically it's nonsense. That's not really how it happens. Anybody that's familiar with guns and such like that knows that people don't go yeah when they're shot. And you know the way that Arnold Schwarzenegger takes 10 bullets to the shoulder or whatever and then shrugs it off. Come on. It doesn't work like that. Like, Hollywood is an incredible reach. It is. I mean, Edward Bernays recognised it as he said essentially this is one of the most powerful propaganda tools that exists because as you said, it's so incredibly far-reaching. I mean, what's very interesting, and again, I'm sorry, we are drifting into paranoid territory here, but there was a definite shift from Russians being the enemy in action films like, you know, the first Rambo films and stuff like that, to Arabs being the films. There was a raft of films like Executive Decision and The Siege and Courage Under Fire and True Lies, all of which had the very top stars of the time, Bruce Willis and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Denzel Washington and all of these people, that all of a sudden pegged Arab people as or people from the Middle East as the bad guys, which was particularly embarrassing for the Rambo films, because in the second one the Mujahideen were his allies. But there is an argument that does culture inform real life, or does real life inform culture? You know, art imitate life, or life imitating art. Was that because basically all these people were like, well, this is the way that the zeitgeist is going. This is what is relevant in the world today, or you know, it's a bit of a chicken and egg conversation. But there's numerous books, like the TV Arab is a very good one, that basically discuss this and point out numerous occasions where, wow, this looks like very, very heavy propaganda that's not founded in a lot of fact.
Yeah, we're coming up at the very end here. It's been very interesting. I'm going to call you back later, you know, in the future for another show. But how can people get more information about your books, your website, and so forth?
Oh, right. Well, my website's called neilsandersmindcontrol.com, and you can get there's lots of videos on there as well of me on like previous radio shows and television shows and stuff like that. You can buy the books there as well. They're called Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Mind Control, Mass Manipulation and Perception Management, and then there's Volume 2, which is Marketing, Movies and Music. First one is like the nuts and bolts of the American and the English mind control programs that were performed on civilians and troops, ran the gamut from hypnosis, drugs, psychotronic weaponry, mass propaganda, and even perhaps the use of trauma and terror on civilian populations, maybe even including serial killers, in order to make them more malleable. And then the second one looks at the way that the marketing industry manipulates you, the way that movies can be used as propaganda, the way that the music industry can be used as propaganda. And it winds up with a nice essay talking about the CIA's LSD program, and the suggestion that perhaps the hippie explosion of the Haight-Ashbury was actually a scientific test that was carried out by the government, because it transpires that not only were all the LSD gurus that handed out the drugs CIA operatives and connected to military-industrial families, but also a surprising amount of the musicians that made that scene so memorable were also connected to families that were deeply entrenched in CIA, military espionage, and mind control.
Absolutely fantastic. And I'll just say this. I've looked into a lot of this kind of stuff before, and it's mind-blowing, but it's actually accurate. So any listeners out there that are going, whoa, what's this all about? Look it up for yourself. You know, see what you find. Anyway, thanks a lot, Neil. That
No,
was
thank you.
great,
So it's
and keep up the good work.
Thank you. It's also available on Kindle via Amazon, and it's slightly cheaper. Well, it's a third of the price on there as well. So if people want to have it on Kindle, but thank you very much for inviting me on. I had a very, very pleasant time.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
You are listening to UCY.tv. Why don't you stick around?